Hi, everybody. In this video, I want to talk about the information cycle and the various source types that we talk about when we are learning about how information works. Uh, so let's start with this. Let's say we have an event, some kind of event that happens, okay? I don't know, maybe it's a natural disaster, let's say, or maybe, God forbid, some kind of terrorist attack, right? Or maybe we could use something like Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Whatever that event is, what kind of information will be available first about that event within minutes and hours of the event? And where would you find that information? We just think about that for a second. Just within minutes and maybe just a couple hours of the event. Generally, that information would come probably from firsthand accounts, probably videos, photos, right? Maybe some preliminary news reporting, possibly kind of blog posts, especially if they're linking to these other sources, probably social media, right? That kind of makes sense. People have phones, and so you're probably going to see this stuff happening and being circulated on social media probably first, right? And then maybe some preliminary news blurbs. And of course, you'd find that on the web, various news outlets, social media, and they would probably take the form of videos and recordings, right? Maybe some interviews by witnesses and participants of the event. Okay, so that's within just the first few minutes. Now, let's say we have days and weeks go by after an event like this, okay? What kind of information will become available about it, and where would you find that kind of information? Well, within a few days and weeks, you'll see more detailed coverage as the story comes out more fully. So maybe you'll see some more, you'll see some commentary. You'll continue to see things like interviews of people who were eyewitnesses, but you'll start to see some analysis and opinion, maybe some discussion. Maybe people will start putting together timelines of the event about exactly what happened, when, and where. And you might get some experts that they'll bring out and give us more information and interpretation. And you'll find this stuff again in newspapers and news sources, both online and in print, magazines. Um, you'll also you'll also find them circulated on social media, of course, because that's where a lot of our information gets circulated. But my point here is that this kind of information will now be found in longer form, maybe, and then you'll find pieces by journalists and reporters, but also news analysts and commentators, and possibly, as I said, some experts, right? Now, within months after the event, moving more down the line in terms of time here, what will be available and where would we find it? Well, within months, you're going to get information becoming clearer. You're going to get more evidence that comes out and sifted through. Um, you'll probably start to see more sustained and maybe even scholarly or scientific, depending on the nature of the event, analysis and interpretation of the event. So you'll still see opinion pieces. People are still probably going to be debating it, and you'll still see um, uh, more news reporting about it, especially if there's kind of aftermath or something. But now you're going to start to see experts more formally making judgments and giving information and opinion about what's going on. And you'll find this in what we call scholarly journals and publications, which are written by experts for experts. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit on this video. And we'll probably see more sustained, evaluative, and analytical pieces in serious publications, probably say long form journalism pieces in publications like The Atlantic or Harper's, publications that print longer, more in depth analyses, and also some scholarly work will start to appear months down the line at the earliest from an event. 6 months and even later after the event, what's going to be available and where would we find it? You're going to continue to see writing and opinion and other productions by experts and thinkers. Pardon the typo there. Uh, More scholarly work will be done because more time has gone by and there's more evidence for scholars and researchers to reflect and analyze and evaluate and develop arguments about. And you'll see even longer analysis and discussion. And you might even start to see, a few years after the event or 6 months and out, maybe ebooks or even possibly some actual print books coming out on the subject and books for a wide audience as well. Maybe, depending on the kind of event, government reports, maybe analysis, research publications, and more sustained in-depth analysis. And then finally, years after the event, what's going to be available and where would you find it? As more and more information and sources accumulate, because now we're talking about years, right? And all of that stuff that I've already talked about is out there floating around, it's published and available. As more time goes by, years quite often, experts and others will start compiling bodies of information and helping other people find that information. In other words, they will produce documents that actually help others learn about this event to help them navigate the topic. And these may take the forms of various kinds of bibliographies or encyclopedia entries, specialized encyclopedia entries, various catalogs of information or database listings or websites devoted to pulling together information about that event and where people might find it, and other sorts of documents like literature reviews, which are write-ups that basically summarize the scholarly work done on a topic and so on. Okay. Now, that's a messy timeline, right? And I want us to understand that sort of information cycle in order to talk about the different kinds of sources that get produced in that information cycle, because these are the sources that we're going to find in our research. Whenever we're looking at a source or something we're calling a source, right? We want to understand, like, how does that source relate to the topic we are investigating, or in this case, to the event that happened. And by the way, when I use the word event here, I gave us the example of an actual sort of news event, right? A literal event that happens in time, like a war or a natural disaster or something like that, or a rise in the Fed's interest rates or something like that. We can also talk about events, right, as the publication or the production of a piece of art, for instance. So I want us to keep that in mind for what I'm going to talk about next. So an event can also mean the publication or production of a work of art, like a piece of literature or a play or a movie, or a painting or a sculpture, that sort of thing. Okay, so keep that in mind. Those can also be loosely defined as events. Um, so how do we classify these different types of sources? Well, there are three basic types of sources: primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. And as you'll see in the next few minutes, we can understand these sources based on that information cycle we just talked about. So here we go. Let's start with primary sources, which sort of makes sense, right? They're primary. Primary sources are original materials. We can also think of them as the events or the things that are very close to events in that loose sense. Okay, so these can include, or sorry, primary sources are basically sources that are unfiltered through others' interpretations or commentaries, and they are basically the targets of research. They're the things that research is conducted about. All right, and here are some examples of primary sources. They can include original scientific studies, which I'll talk about more in just a second, the laws and court decisions, journal entries, diary entries, firsthand and eyewitness accounts of an event, works of art themselves, interviews, historical documents themselves, autobiographies, biographies written by the person themselves, photographs, speeches, TV and internet broadcasts, video recordings, and similar documents. These are sources that are original and they are unfiltered by others' interpretations. Okay. In the sciences and in the social sciences, when a group conducts, or a person conducts an original study where they're making new knowledge, right? They're discovering new knowledge. That is also a primary source. And maybe a way to think about it is, when I get together with some other scientists and we conduct a study, we engineer this study, we carry it out, right? We are actually creating, I guess, an event, right? The study is the event. And therefore, when we write that up and summarize that event, we are producing a kind of primary source. Okay. And similarly, works of art and literature and so on are also primary sources because they're unmediated by other interpretations or commentary. They're the work itself. Okay, so that's a primary source. Original material, original documents that are right at ground zero of whatever it is that we are studying. So if I'm studying, let's say, Abraham Lincoln, right, then Lincoln's Letters and journal entries would all be primary sources. Any documents that are contemporary with Abraham Lincoln that might have involved, his knowledge or even not his knowledge, right, would be primary sources. The text of his speeches and even contemporary newspaper reports about actual events regarding Lincoln would all be primary sources, targets of research that scholars might conduct. Then there are secondary sources. And as you might intuit by the name, secondary sources, these are sources that discuss, interpret, analyze, or otherwise comment upon primary sources. Okay, so if you're looking at a source, at some sort of article, let's say, and it's analyzing something about Abraham Lincoln, right? Maybe it's a historical work that's written by an historian who wants us to understand Lincoln better. Then that would be a secondary source. It would be somebody commenting upon the primary sources involved. In the humanities, so this would be like history, philosophy, literature, for instance. Most articles and books written on a topic they're generally secondary sources. That is, if you're an historian or a philosopher or a literary scholar and you write an article or a book, right? Generally, it's going to be a secondary source because to write that book, you are studying primary documents. You are studying primary sources. So a biography of Abraham Lincoln, right, written by, say, an historian, is a secondary source because it interprets and analyzes primary documents surrounding Lincoln's life. So by the same token, if I write a book on John Milton's great poem Paradise Lost from the 17th century, the poem is the primary source, and my analysis, my article or book, is a secondary source because I am interpreting and analyzing the primary source. Now, in the social sciences and, say, the hard sciences, generally speaking, articles and books that summarize, interpret, or report on other studies are typically considered secondary sources. So remember what I said just a minute ago. In the sciences, when a group or a person engineers their own study, they conduct their own original study, and then they write an article about it. That's a primary source because the study is kind of an event, and they are reporting on that event as a primary source. They are explaining that study to readers, right? But in the sciences and social sciences, when you have an article or a book that summarizes and interprets other studies, so it's not necessarily an originally designed study, but it's analyzing and making sense out of other studies that have been done, then it would be a secondary source, again, because it's commenting upon primary sources. Note the slippery case of like news articles. News articles, like in newspapers or news sites or magazines, they can be either secondary or primary. And that depends upon, that actually depends upon what your research project is, right? And also the nature of the article. So a newspaper source or a news story is a primary source when it's reporting on the details of an event that's happening, okay? So if you have a piece of news reporting and it's simply reporting what's going on with that whatever event is happening, right? Then that's probably a primary source. It's reporting on events on the ground. But if a news article offers commentary or some kind of interpretation, right, or if it's happening later in time from the event, much later in time from the event, and it's commenting on that event or interpreting it in some way or offering an opinion on it in some way, then it's more of a secondary source. So for instance, a newspaper article from 1865 actually reporting on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln would be a primary source. That's a news source reporting on the event of the day, right? And we'd be interested in looking at that newspaper for what it tells us about the event. That's a primary source. However, if we're looking at, contemporary newspaper today, and it's reporting on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln as a kind of anniversary article, right, or a kind of within the context of a timeline or some kind of interpretation of that event. Well, then it's a secondary source, right? It's commenting on an event. Finally, we have tertiary sources. That's the third level. These are distillations of entire bodies of information for the purposes of reference and instruction. Okay, they summarize, discuss, or otherwise describe primary and secondary sources, and their basic job is to give readers, to give partakers, an overview of the knowledge on a topic, right? And of the sources on the topic. So think of that as like a third level out. Um, these are works that are helping teach people about the basics of a topic or giving overviews of the topic. And as such, that includes things like textbooks, encyclopedias, dictionaries, almanacs, timelines, chronologies, databases where directing you to various primary and secondary sources, various indices or bibliographies, fact books, and other kinds of reference works. So in short, tertiary, when you think of a tertiary source, think reference work, think textbook, think encyclopedia. Sources that give readers, that give people a broad overview of the topic, including all the material that has been written or produced about that topic for the purposes of again, reference and helping people understand how that topic works and the various resources that are available about it. And we can think of this relationship graphically, sort of as concentric circles. That can be a way to think about it, with primary sources being sort of ground zero here, the original works, the new knowledge, right? Original works and the new knowledge surrounding an event. And then you have secondary sources, which is kind of one step removed, where they're analyzing and commenting upon primary sources. And then the farthest circle out, right? That's tertiary sources, which would be distillations and reference works about like the whole topic or the whole field. Okay. And there's one other distinction that we should make, okay, to help us identify the types of sources we're looking at, and that's the difference between what we call scholarly sources versus non-scholarly sources. And I want you to understand that this is not a distinction of like good versus bad. It's not scholarly sources are good and everything else is bad. It's just scholarly sources are a very particular kind of source, okay, that I want you to understand, because they're actually what's set the pace for the various fields of study that are out there. Scholarly sources are sources that are written by scholars or scientists for scholars and scientists. They're not written for a general audience at all. They are written for other people who are specialists in the field. And they are where newly discovered knowledge is first formally written up and explained to other scholars and scientists. And they're peer-reviewed usually. And in fact, most of the time when people talk about scholarly sources, they generally mean peer-reviewed sources. So what is peer review? Okay. Well, peer review is a process whereby if you're a scholar or a scientist of some kind and you want to publish the results of your study, okay, you will identify a journal, some sort of academic journal. All right, so every academic and scientific field has a whole bunch of different scholarly journals. Okay, there are literally hundreds and hundreds out there, um, uh, thousands out there, really, depending on the subject area. Okay, and what you do is, let's say I'm a scholar. Okay, trained as a scholar of Renaissance literature myself. I've been through this process. Let's say I've done a study of some Shakespearean plays, and I've discovered something new about them, and I've written this up after doing my careful study and archive work, and I've written up a 30-page article reporting my findings, and I want it published in a magazine like, an academic journal like Studies in English Literature or something, okay, or English Literary Renaissance. So I send my article draft to the editor of that journal. The editor, who may not be a specialist in, say, Shakespeare studies, looks at it, and he or she makes a decision right off the top. Does this look good enough to publish in our journal? Are we interested in this piece? If that editor says yes, we are, then he or she will send copies of this article draft without my name on it. My name will be taken off, and we'll send it to often 2 or 3 other scholars in my field. Okay, so other Shakespearean scholars, other scholars of Renaissance literature, and they will read my draft. They'll read my study without knowing who wrote it, and then they will decide whether my study meets the standards of scholarship for their field. Okay, doesn't mean that they necessarily agree with my conclusions or anything. It just means that my study, they're deciding whether my study looks rigorous enough and sound enough to be published in their prestigious journal. Okay, and when they make a decision about that, they send a reader's report back to the editor to let the editor know, hey, we'd like this article, we like this study. or we don't like this study, we'd like to reject this. Or in a lot of cases, we like the study, but we would ask that a few things are revised to account for, the latest scholarship or something like that. Okay. And then my article will come back to me. The editor will include the reader's reports, and then I will probably make some revisions if it's accepted, so that eventually the journal will publish my study. In the sciences and social sciences, there's a similar process whereby a scientific article, right, will then be sent out to the journal's readers, other scientists who are experts in that field, and they will make a decision about whether the study meets the methodologies and the standards of scientific study for their field. And the idea behind this process is that ideally, it is a way to make sure that when studies appear in these journals, they are rigorous, and they meet the standards of scholarship for a field. It doesn't automatically mean that the study's conclusions are necessarily totally correct, but it means that the readers of this article have good reason to believe, again, ideally, have good reason to believe that the study is rigorous, and it's something we should really pay attention to. It's a quality piece of work. Okay, that's the idea behind peer review, so that other experts vet studies to make sure they meet certain basic standards of scientific inquiry or scholarly inquiry. And again, scholarly sources, therefore, they often take the form of articles published in academic journals, and then often they can also be published as books, which can also be scholarly sources because they go, a scholarly book will go through a very similar peer review process as a scholarly article before it gets published. Okay, so then how can we identify scholarly sources? Like when we're looking at a source, how can we tell it's scholarly? Now, first off, I'm going to say this is one of those things that as you read more research and you gain more college education, this is something you kind of develop a feel for. But as novices, as apprentices, right, we can make some generalizations about what scholarly sources look like. And here are some tips for identifying, hey, this is a scholarly source. The authors listed will probably have credentials like a PhD and also a university affiliation, and they're foregrounded, meaning the authors will actually have their degrees and their university's affiliation listed right after their names so that we clearly see, oh, okay, this is a scholar or an expert, okay? They will sometimes, not always, have multiple authors, especially in the sciences. Sciences and social sciences, scholarly studies will often have multiple authors. They often, not always, but a scholarly source often includes an abstract, which is a summary of the article's contents, usually right at the top of the article. And this is so that busy researchers, like myself, can decide fairly quickly if the whole study is worth reading or not. That can often be a way to help a researcher decide whether a source is worth their time, because maybe it's not relevant to their research. Scholarly sources, they're often long, right? Maybe 20 plus pages, hard to make a rule of thumb, but but if it's only a couple pages long, then chances are it's probably not a scholarly source. Scholarly studies are often quite long. And they very often, I would say almost always, have very discipline-specific language and jargon. So high-level language, very specialized language, the kind of language that is clearly not pitched to just a generally educated reader or an everyday reader, but they're clearly pitched, aimed at other scholars or scientists. Scholarly sources often have complex, descriptive, and, let's face it, boring titles, because the purpose of a title of a scholarly source is often to inform, right? We want to help other researchers decide whether it's worth reading, right? What is this source about? So longer, more detailed titles as opposed to sort of sexier, flashier titles. And scholarly sources will often include data, tables, graphs, and charts, especially in the sciences, right, and social sciences, but depending on the humanities area, also in the humanities. So lots of data and undigested data, which they're examining and analyzing. And in the humanities, you might also see like long quotations from primary sources because historians, say, and literary scholars are interpreting and analyzing those documents, and therefore they often are quoting from them at length and possibly even showing images of these documents, depending on the nature of the document. Scholarly sources have very little, if any, advertising, like really at all. It's very text heavy. They are often published no more than quarterly, often annually. So that means you're not going to, scholarly sources, scholarly journals are generally not published monthly or weekly. There might be some exceptions, but generally quarterly or annually, possibly monthly. And if you think about it, it makes sense based on that peer review process. It's a long process, right? That's a very involved process that's simply not feasible to do to produce a weekly or a monthly publication, right? So they're generally published in quarters or annually. And probably the most telling sign of all, and this probably should have gone first, but I probably saved the best for last year. Scholarly sources will always include what we call a scholarly apparatus. And scholarly apparatus refers to basically the bibliography or works cited or list of references that a source has, as well as the documentation. Okay, so when you're looking at a source, scholarly sources are heavily referenced because they're showing their readers all these other studies and pieces of information that are important to the study you're reading. Okay, so scholarly sources will always have quite lengthy bibliographies or works cited pages, lots of citations, that is, lots of documentation in the text itself. Often lots of footnotes or endnotes. Very hard to mistake quite often because in some cases those footnotes or endnotes are many pages long themselves. So the bottom line is scholarly sources have a scholarly apparatus. Now, I'm going to give you examples of this. I will give you examples of these sorts of sources in another video. This one is probably already long enough, but I hope you feel like you have a better understanding of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources and how those relate to what we call the information cycle. And then you have kind of a fundamental grasp of what scholarly sources are and how they connect up to the information cycle, because scholarly sources, as you might have inferred by now, that's where studies are first published, and as a result, they are often what's behind news stories and other kinds of articles when those other sources talk about when they talk about new studies showing something, right? So scholarly sources are where new knowledge is made in the sciences and in the humanities. And so I want you to be able to feel like you can distinguish what they look like as well. See you in the next video.